The Royal Commission is now in session.
Mr. Rosen.
Thank you, Commissioner Vigoni. Good afternoon, Commissioners. This week you've heard from 3 direct experience witnesses, each of whom gave harrowing evidence about the experience of COVID-19 on their loved ones. Ms Clark, whose father passed away of COVID-19 at Newmarch House in April, a witness who was given the pseudonym UY, whose father could not cope with the anxiety and distress of the lockdown and died in a nursing home in Melbourne, and Mel Mitchell, who told you of the limitations on her already limited life caused by the response to COVID-19 in her nursing home. This evidence brought home yet again that the problems that bedevil our aged care system have their most profound impact on the people who receive care and their families. You've also heard from a number of highly qualified experts. Aged care providers and representatives of the aged care workforce have explained how COVID-19 is impacting on the sector more broadly. 3 senior union officials told you of the day-to-day struggle of their members working in aged care with inadequate PPE and training. And yesterday you heard from the senior officials who oversee and regulate the sector. In our submission, what emerges from the evidence are 3 key conclusions. A, that COVID-19 has presented and continues to present the Australian aged care sector with an unprecedented challenge. B, everyone involved, both in aged care homes and in government, has worked and is working very diligently to respond to that challenge. And C, none of the problems that have been associated with the response of the aged care sector to COVID-19 was unforeseeable. On the central question of how well prepared the sector was for COVID-19, we will be submitting that it was not well prepared. Because the risk of an outbreak of COVID-19 in an aged care home is extremely high, even with low rates of community transmission, there needed to be a planned, proportionate response to protect the elderly, frail residents in nursing homes from this pernicious virus. We say that the level of risk demanded a level of preparedness that was very high. This may be the key to why there is a disagreement between what we are saying and Professor Murphy's evidence yesterday that the sector was very well prepared. Tragically, not all that could be done was done. The sector was not properly prepared in March before the Dorothy Henderson Lodge and Newmarch House outbreaks. The lessons of those 2 outbreaks were not properly conveyed to the sector, and as a result, the sector was not properly prepared in June 2020 when we witnessed high levels of community transmission of the virus in Melbourne. And based on the evidence that you've heard, the sector is not properly prepared now. Commissioners, the federal government, which has sole responsibility for aged care, was firmly on notice early in 2020 about the many challenges the sector would face if there were outbreaks of COVID-19. And that notice came from a variety of sources. First, the limitations of the aged care workforce had been well documented in reports such as the 2018 report of the Aged Care Workforce Task Force. The sector is understaffed and it lacks nurses with clinical skills. Secondly, it was widely reported that in both Europe and North America, residents in nursing homes were dying in large numbers as a result of COVID-19. Thirdly, the interim report of this Royal Commission in October 2019 revealed a range of problems that beset the sector, including workforce challenges, governance problems, and the challenges associated with the interface between the aged care sector and the state health systems. And finally, individuals like Professor Ibrahim and organisations such as the Australian Nursing and Midwifery Federation had raised their concerns about the sector's lack of preparedness for COVID-19 and had offered solutions. Any aged care sector plan had, at the very least, to identify each of these matters and provide a detailed and practical set of solutions to them. That is what we mean by a thorough plan. That is the benchmark we're utilising to reach the judgment we have reached. We've decided to focus in these oral submissions on the question of preparedness, on the questions of preparedness and quality of life, including visitors. Many important issues have been traversed over the last 3 days, including staffing, hospital transfers, training, and personal protective equipment use. In the time we have available today, it's not possible to do justice to them all. They will, however, be addressed in the written submissions we will provide to you and the parties tomorrow afternoon. In the time we have available now, we will address you only on preparedness and quality of life, including visitors, because they seem to us to be the issues of pressing and immediate importance to the lives of the residents in nursing homes. Before I address you on those topics, I need to outline some important aspects of the evidence of a contextual nature. From the first panel on Monday, you heard about two important public health principles, the precautionary principle and the population-focused principle. They both are important in this context. Professor Spurrier, the Chief Public Health Officer in South Australia, explained that the precautionary principle requires public health decision makers to err on the side of caution, even where the science is not settled and they may not have all the evidence in. The principle has a particular application in a pandemic. The principle is enshrined in the public health statutes of the states and territories. There's no equivalent in the Commonwealth Aged Care Act 1997. There should be. The population-focused principle requires decisions to be made to protect and improve the health of the community as a whole while considering the health of individuals. This can mean that individual choices may have to make way for the greater good. As we're all learning, that is the appropriate and necessary approach to a societal response to a pandemic. For example, as Professor Spurrier explained, a person who's confined to a hotel is obviously having rights they otherwise have overridden. Professor Spurrier agreed that the South Australian Department of Health's approach to hospital transfers of COVID-19 residents is a practical example of the population-focused principle. The approach is concerned as much with the clinical needs of the positive resident as it is with what Professor McClaw's described as the negative resident's right to remain negative. Advanced care directives are respected in a hospital setting. The second contextual matter is the need for a proportionate response to the very high risk posed to aged care residents by the virus, especially in times of community transmission. In the workplace safety context, everything reasonably practicable must be done to safeguard workers. We apply the same standard here, but note that the standard of reasonable practicability is not fixed and adapts to the likelihood of a risk manifesting and the likely consequences if it does. The third matter is that witnesses have referred to COVID-19 as a novel virus about which our understanding continues to evolve. Professor Spurrier said as much in her evidence. Planning must respond to new knowledge, both scientific and practical. Plans that are found not to work must be discarded and replaced promptly. Another implication of this is that it's important not to judge action that occurred in February 2020 based on what we now know about the science surrounding the virus. Having said that, as Professor Ibrahim pointed out, all of his concerns were reasonably foreseeable to the informed observer. We examined the evidence about preparedness in 3 time periods. The first is February to March, before the first outbreak at Dorothy Henderson Lodge. The second period is April to June, before the community outbreak in Melbourne. And the third period is June to August, as the sector is currently responding to that outbreak and preparing for the future. We start with the February-March period and ask, did the Commonwealth Government have a COVID-19 response plan specifically for the aged care sector? Answering this important question requires an understanding of what an aged care response plan looks like. This in turn requires a careful examination of the evidence. Professor Murphy was nothing if not clear yesterday about his position. He told you that the Commonwealth's initial planning for the aged care consisted of 2 documents. And I quote, he said there was an overarching Australian government coronavirus health response plan that was released and activated in February. And secondly, there was a fundamental foundational plan, the CDNA outbreaks in residential aged care facilities plan. I note in passing that the word plan does not appear in the title of that document. I'll return to that. Professor Murphy also referred to a number of other laudable initiatives and expenditures. He detailed them in the statement that he made. We don't doubt they occurred, Commissioners, but we would characterise those as reacting, not planning. I'll start with the COVID-19 emergency response plan for the Australian health sector in place in February 2020. It's a 56-page document that sets out different scenarios that require responses, governance arrangements, decision-making and consultative arrangements, and communication and coordination arrangements. It also adapted an existing document, the Australian Health Management Plan for Pandemic Influenza, to set out an operational plan which provided additional detail to support the implementation of activities under the COVID-19 health sector plan at an operational level. There are a number of references to the aged care sector in the health sector plan, but there's no detail about the aged care sector. The plan did note that additional strategies may be required to support aged care. As Professor Ibrahim observed, the health sector plan was silent on known gaps in the aged care system. Put simply, as its title indicates, it is a plan, It's just not an aged care plan. The many unique features of the aged care sector, with which you are now so familiar, required a bespoke plan. But while the health sector plan is not an aged care response plan, it does provide an insight into what an aged care response plan would have looked like. Any such plan needed to identify at least the following failures and shortcomings associated with the aged care sector, which needed to be addressed to equip it to respond to COVID-19. A, gaps in workforce numbers and training, including the likelihood that more staff would be necessary to deliver care during the pandemic. B, access to PPE and training in its proper use. C, the lack of clinical skills, especially in infection control. D, personal care workers who lack the foundational standards about infection control that are taken for granted in the health sector. E, the challenges of achieving high-level infection control in a home-like setting. F, deficiencies in governance and managerial ability in parts of the sector. G, the significant operational differences between aged care facilities and hospitals. And finally, the challenges associated with the interface with the state health sector. Another matter that could have been addressed in a Commonwealth Government COVID-19 response plan for the aged care sector was the identification of scenarios and responses. For example, what would be the response to an increase in community transmission? What circumstances would act as triggers and what actions would follow? Similarly, if there was an outbreak in one home without community transmission, how would the response manifest? The other document to which Professor Murphy referred is the Communicable Diseases Network Australia's guidelines for residential facilities, which were published on 13 March 2020 and subsequently updated on 30 April 2020 and 14 July 2020. All three versions are in the general tender bundle. The CDNA, as I'll call it, is a subcommittee of the Australian Health Protection Principle Committee, the AHPPC. The CDNA has 24 members, none of whom is an aged care specialist. We note that the CDNA consulted Dr. Roth, who works on a part-time basis as the Chief Clinical Advisor to the Aged Care Quality and Safety Commission in the development of this document. While we do attach some importance to the title of the document, it's a set of guidelines rather than a plan, it's more important in our submission to consider the substance. Does the document plan the governmental response for the aged care sector in the way the health response plan does that for the health sector? Does it address those various features of and gaps in aged care identified above, and does it provide solutions? The first thing to note about the CDNA document is that, like the health sector plan, it is based on, and I quote, previous work on influenza outbreaks in residential care facilities in Australia, unquote. This derivation of the document may partly explain why some aged care providers may have thought that their existing influenza plans would hold them in good stead for COVID-19, only to find that they left them woefully unprepared. The evidence of Ms. Roy of Anglicare on this point was compelling. I should just interrupt myself there to point out that the evidence of Ms. Roy and also Mr. Millard of Anglicare is very valuable, because they were quite prepared to confront problems that they had and admit errors that they had made in their planning and lessons drawn from that. When Ms. Roy was asked to reflect on her team's assessment of Newmarch House as best practice, she said this: "I considered the assessment to be accurate at the time. In light of the preparedness measures set out above and with regard to then current resources about preparation, including the CDNA's best practice guidelines, which we understood to represent the appropriate steps that should be taken to prepare for an outbreak." Any aged care response plan worth its salt needs to explain how the aged care health interface will be addressed. As Professor Ibrahim said, it doesn't take great insight to see that having 3 to 4 different groups in authority wanting to run something is going to create confusion. You've heard evidence of that confusion both in the Newmarch House response in April in Sydney and also the Hammond Care response in Melbourne in mid-May. How did the CDNA guidelines address this vital planning question? In the first 2 iterations, they didn't address it at all. Remarkably, the first 2 versions made no mention of the federal government having a role in the aged care system, that it funds and oversees to the total exclusion of the states. After trying to explain that it was unnecessary to make any reference to the role of the federal government in the document because the document was a Commonwealth document, Mr. Lai yesterday ultimately accepted that the Commonwealth's role probably needed to be made explicit. It wasn't until the third version of the document in July that the Commonwealth's role was set out, and only then at a very high level. While the advisory role of state and territory governments is summarised, the guidelines make no attempt to address how the various levels of government will interact and who's responsible for questions such as the circumstances in which a resident who tests positive to COVID-19 will be transferred to hospital. We submit that this is what an aged care sector plan has to do. As the health sector plan noted, and I quote, a clear understanding of the roles and responsibilities between parties responding to a novel coronavirus outbreak will support quick decision-making and efficient coordinated use of resources, end quote. As important as this is in the health sector, which is largely a state responsibility, it is acutely important in aged care, as was very well known to those in the sector and government early this year. The lack of such a clear understanding was apparent in the new March House response in April. As Mr Millard told the Anglicare board, and I quote, over the course of the outbreak, there's been a frustrating level of dysfunction in the collaboration between Newmarch House Anglicare management and the numerous government departments, agencies and hospital employees at both federal and state level with an interest in management of the outbreak. And he went on, and I quote, Anglicare has looked to these authorities for their expert advice in dealing with the outbreak, but this advice has often been conflicting. Further, there's a lack of clarity regarding which of these authorities has responsibility for decisions and how this authority intersects with Anglicare's responsibilities under the Aged Care Act to manage the home. Commissioners, the respective roles of aged care providers, the Commonwealth and New South Wales Government were clarified in the course of the new March House response in April of this year. These arrangements were not formalised until on or about 23 June 2020, when they were reflected in a joint protocol. The purpose of this protocol is to formalise the coordination of government support to an aged care provider in their management of COVID-19 outbreak in a Commonwealth-funded residential aged care in New South Wales. It's not a complex document, but it sets out the roles and responsibilities of the Commonwealth Government, aged care providers and the various New South Wales government agencies. While it could no doubt be more comprehensive and detailed, it does also include governance arrangements and it identifies trigger events. Such a document could easily have been prepared in February before any outbreak of COVID-19 in a residential aged care facility in New South Wales. Instead, the protocol was formalised in June and was developed as a response to the two outbreaks in New South Wales earlier in 2020. According to Dr Lyons of New South Wales Health, who gave evidence on yesterday, the New South Wales protocol has been shared with the Australian Health Ministers Advisory Council as what he described as good practice in how to facilitate fast mobilisation of required government support to a residential aged care facility in the event of a COVID-19 outbreak. It is clearly desirable that state-specific protocols be in place. Mr Ly's unwillingness to acknowledge this in his evidence yesterday is difficult to understand. Despite the reference of the New South Wales protocol to that ministerial council, it's not apparent that similar protocols are in place even now in other states and territories. Professor Spurrier told you on Monday that she was not sure if there was a framework document that governed the relationship between the Commonwealth and the South Australian governments. She subsequently confirmed there is no protocol between South Australia and the Commonwealth. Other than New South Wales, it would appear there are no other protocols that set out coordination arrangements. This is what we mean when we say the aged care sector is still not properly prepared for COVID-19. It is unacceptable that such arrangements were not in place in February. It's unforgivable that they're not in place in August. The virus is not a fair fighter, Commissioners. It doesn't wait until the bell rings. Professor Spurrier explained that South Australia's approach had been influenced by a number of factors, including the state's geography, the setup of the state health system, advice from the World Health Organization, including making a decision to transfer all infected residents to a dedicated hospital, and the availability of negative pressure rooms and intensive care facilities. She acknowledged that not all state health systems are set up in the same way and suggested that how hospitals are set up, networked, and the associated governance for that system would influence the decision about whether to transfer infected residents to hospital in other states. In light of this evidence, we readily accept that any national plan clearly needs to be supplemented by state-specific plans taking into account such matters. But where is the sense of urgency to get this done? Professor Ibrahim said yesterday that the CDNA is not a plan for the sector. He said, and I quote, I can't overemphasise that the CDNA plan is a plan for an individual facility. It's not a plan for the country. We submit that's correct. To the extent that the CDNA document can be described as a plan, it was a plan for individual facilities and not for the sector as a whole. As its name indicates, it was guiding their approach. It didn't contain sector-wide initiatives such as a surge workforce and Commonwealth state protocols. Those matters, which could and should have been in place in February, were addressed in a reactive way and then only partially in April and June, respectively. Commissioners, there's no reason why our government should be scrambling now to be putting such arrangements in place. This should have all been done back in February when the health plan was being prepared and disseminated. Individual states had COVID-19 plans for their aged care sectors. At least one individual provider made provision for developing increased preparedness before the virus arrived in Australia and of stockpiling PPE. There are no doubt other examples. That's just the one we heard about. Commissioners, none of this is intended to be a criticism of the CDNA guidelines. For what it's worth, we consider it's a helpful document. It's just not an aged care sector preparedness plan. What about the Aged Care Regulator? The Aged Care Quality and Safety Commission was asked in a notice dated the 26th of June 2020 under the Royal Commissions Act issued by you, Commissioners, to produce a copy of any pandemic plan or risk-based framework prepared by or for the Aged Care Quality and Safety Commission for the aged care sector on a variety of dates. In response to this demand, the Aged Care Quality and Safety Commission produced the documents which are found at tabs 21 and 22 of the General Tender Bundle. The first is a document entitled, quote, the Commission's Regulatory Response. The second is entitled, quote, Aged Care Quality and Safety Commission, Proportionate Risk-Based Regulatory Response to COVID-19. It is an adaptation of the well-known regulatory pyramid developed by Professor John Braithwaite. Appearing on the screen there is, on the left is the first document, on the right is the second. Whatever else may be said about the documents, they're not the comprehensive plan or regulator facing the COVID-19 pandemic needed. Such a plan in our submission would have included, for example, a thorough profile of all aged care facilities along the lines of that suggested by Professor Ibrahim in his précis of evidence. It ought reasonably have referred to deficits in infection control that had emerged from recent regulatory action. It might also have provided a template for the range of best practice tasks and preparation that providers ought to be carrying out. Appropriate monitoring arrangements would also have been identified. Such arrangements would have addressed the lack of visibility of events in nursing homes identified in the South Australian Health Department's submission to you. As that submission observed, the cessation in March 2020 by the regulator of unannounced visits to homes at a time when on-site visits by families were severely limited, quote, reduced the level of regulation and oversight of the quality of care being delivered within residential aged care facilities, close quote. It was incumbent on the regulator to have strategies in place to fill that gap. Another matter that should have been part of the regulator's planning was a system that passed on any vital information it obtained in its routine monitoring work. For example, if in carrying out that work, an employee of the Commission found out about a COVID-19 outbreak, that information should be routinely conveyed to the Department of Health immediately in case the provider had not met its responsibilities to report under the first 24 hours document that you heard about yesterday. Ms Anderson was unable to explain to you why such information was not conveyed when it came to the attention of one of her employees in a particular case in Melbourne in July. She informed you that she has now put in place an arrangement to ensure that happens routinely. Yet again, Commissioners, that's reacting, not planning. The second period we examine is May to June 2020. We ask were the lessons of Dorothy Henderson Lodge and Newmarch House learned. The time between the two Sydney outbreaks and the increase in community transmission in Melbourne in June was an important period for the state of planning to be assessed and, if necessary, augmented. What did the Commonwealth do to ensure that the lessons of the first two aged care outbreaks in Sydney in March and April were conveyed to the aged care sector? We say not enough. We accept that the third version of the CDNA guidelines incorporates some of the learnings. For example, provision is now made for the allocation of a case manager to connect a facility to Commonwealth support, and there is access to a surge workforce which is not limited anymore to just Mabel and Aspen. The Commonwealth is to be congratulated on these initiatives, but much more was and is needed. For example, if one thing was clear from the report by Professor Gilbert, dated the 14th of April into the Dorothy Henderson Lodge outbreak, it was that even a well-managed provider such as Baptist Care needed the help of high-level infection control expertise. This was needed to assist first with the preparation of an outbreak management plan, secondly to provide training to staff, and thirdly to provide help on the ground on day one of an outbreak if one occurred. You may conclude from the evidence that nothing could be more important to help a provider prepare for and respond to a COVID-19 outbreak. You'll recall that the highly experienced aged care nurse, Ms. Roy at Newmarch House, was unaware of the need for this level of infection control expertise. If she didn't know until Ms. Dix from Baptist Care arrived on the 24th of April to assist the response at Newmarch House, how many other providers without access to clinical skills such as those possessed by Ms. Roy were and are similarly ignorant of what is needed to respond to COVID-19? This, Commissioners, is the pointy end of preparedness. It's equipping providers with the knowledge and help they need. You heard from Ms. Dempsey of the Clinical Excellence Commission about the process by which such experts are accredited. She told you that they are credentialed by the Australasian College of Infection Prevention and Control. She chairs the Professional Standards Committee of that college and told you that there are 3 levels of accreditation: primary, advanced and expert. And there are currently 66 credentialed infection control practitioner experts across Australia. They are mainly in our major hospitals and are spread around the country. Most of them work for state governments. In light of what was learned in those early outbreaks, why hasn't the Commonwealth put in place arrangements for easy access by providers to these accredited experts? Several witnesses thought such an approach could work. To be blunt, what could be more important to the nation right now than to deploy these experts to help our floundering aged care sector respond to this pandemic? We submit it's not enough to tell providers that if they request help, they will be provided with a first nurse responder, as the CDNA guidelines do. As competent as such a nurse may be, unless he or she has the level of expertise that Professor Gilbert spoke of in her report, there's a real risk that they will not provide the necessary assistance. For reasons that remain unclear, the Commonwealth did not publish Professor Gilbert's important report. It's full of valuable lessons and was written by a person with serious high-level relevant expertise. It can only help. Excuse me. Another lesson that does not appear to have been learnt is that providers should plan to lose close to their entire workforce in the first few days of an outbreak. The figure of 20 to 30%, which has appeared in the regulator's survey and all 3 iterations of the CDNA guidelines, is plainly wrong, as experience has told us. None of the senior Commonwealth officials from whom you heard yesterday could tell you its genesis. Be that as it may, it should now be confined to the dustbin of history as part of the iterative planning process to which we earlier referred. It should certainly not be part of the current advice of the Commonwealth, because in our submission it has the potential to lull providers into a false sense of security. Despite Mr. Ly's curious efforts to suggest otherwise, it is flatly contradicted by the accurate figure of 80 to 100% in the first 24 hours document. Contradictory advice on important questions is not usually a hallmark of good planning. The third period is June to August 2020, the response to the increase in community transmission of COVID-19 in Melbourne. Commissioners, daily new infection rates in Melbourne rose from 20 on the 16th of June to 76 on the 30th of June 2020. However, masks were not made compulsory for aged care workers until 13 July 2020. That was 2 days after the first recorded death of an aged care resident in Victoria from COVID-19. By the 13th of July 2020, when masks were made compulsory, the number of new infections in Victoria had reached 250. There was a lag between the community infection rates and those in aged care. Until 7 July, there were still no active cases in residential aged care, but by 13 July, there were already 28. That number skyrocketed to over 1,000 by the 9th of August. Death rates are steadily climbing. In the 4 days of this hearing, there have been many further aged care deaths in Victoria. In circumstances that are not entirely clear because of its status as a subcommittee of the National Cabinet, the AHPPC recommended on the 13th of July to the Commonwealth Minister of Health that masks be made compulsory for aged care workers. That was 4 weeks after the steady increase in Victorian community transmissions, which, as I've said, commenced on the 16th of June. The legal instrument by which this important measure concerning masks was effected is unclear. Our researchers have not revealed any instrument imposing the requirement. Professor Murphy was not sure and thought it might have been a Victorian public health order. He said he would have to check. We await the outcome of that checking. Mr. Lai was not necessarily sure it was such an order. This level of confusion by senior officers in the Department of Health is far from reassuring. It appears to have been law by press release. This is not the hallmark of a considered approach, but rather decision-making on the run, reacting to circumstances. Professor Spuria, who is a member of the AHPPC, told you that she couldn't divulge the reasoning of the committee because it is a subcommittee of National Cabinet. We make no criticism of her. Professor Murphy, on the other hand, apparently had no such concerns. He told you the trigger for the advice was prompted by the understanding that the public health response in Victoria was overwhelmed by the growing number of outbreaks in aged care facilities. Professor Murphy and Mr. Lai were unable to clarify if there had been discussions within the AHPPC regarding making mask wearing compulsory any time between 16 June and 13 July. Commissioners, one is left with the sense that it was the death of an aged care resident on 11 July, the first in the current outbreak, that prompted the advice. Would earlier action have limited the spread of COVID-19 into Victoria's nursing homes? Should the requirement for aged care workers to wear masks have been imposed earlier? Professor McLaws had no doubt that the answer to those questions was yes. Even Professor Murphy agreed that, quote, in hindsight, you could have implemented that earlier. Absolutely, he told us yesterday. We question, though, if it really is a matter of hindsight. As Professor McLaws told you, masks are a very cheap and effective method of slowing the spread of COVID-19. Further, she said that 1 or 2 cases, as they started to increase in June, should have been an alert that this is potentially a problem. We asked who was watching the figures and thinking about what they meant for the aged care sector. There was no guidance provided by the AHPPC to aged care providers in this crucial period between 19 June 2020 and 3 August 2020. During that time, the number of new daily infections in Victoria grew from 25 to 413, and the number of active cases in residential aged care grew from 0 to over 500. Did the authorities miss an opportunity? Applying the precautionary principle and acting in a preemptive rather than a reactionary way, we submit the evidence of Professor McLaws ought to be accepted by you. The masks order should have been made earlier. Commissioners will never know whether the earlier imposition of this requirement would have reduced the number of infections and saved lives. Professor Murphy, when asked yesterday, thought it was possible that it may have. The important point to make here, Commissioners, is that the piecemeal and reactive way that the AHPPC and the federal government responded to the threat posed by community transmission in Victoria in June and July emphasises the lack of proper planning earlier in the year. It also lends support to Professor Ibrahim's view that what is needed is a dedicated aged care specific national coordinating body to advise government. It seems to us correct that, as he says, coordinated national expertise for aged care has been missing from the planning process since February of this year, and we continue to suffer from its absence. This could be addressed if a core national unit is established. A national aged care plan. A national aged care plan for COVID-19 could still be put in place with the type of national coordinating body Professor Ibrahim says we need and that he called for in March. Such a body could bring together the expertise about the aged care sector, infection control and emergency preparedness and response is readily available in Australia. Professor Ibrahim also said that the body would need a human rights and a public advocacy group to be there to advocate for the residents because there's no one advocating for the residents. The Victorian Aged Care Response Centre that was established in July is a welcome development, but it is an operational response body, not a forward-looking planning body. A national COVID-19 aged care plan needs to consider the workforce challenges the aged care sector continues to face. It must anticipate the effect of the lack of clinical skills. It must consider what additional training in infection control and PPE use is needed, how it can best be provided and whether it should be made compulsory. It must recognise the need for high-level infection control expertise early in an outbreak response, and it must make appropriate arrangements with organisations such as the Clinical Excellence Commission in New South Wales, so that it's not left to chance whether someone like Ms Dempsey is available to assist a provider. A thorough national plan needs to respond to the challenges associated with the casualised aged care workforce. Such a plan must anticipate that in the face of the risk of infection of the workforce, The difficulties associated with delivering care under COVID-19 conditions will require more care staff, and it must anticipate the costs of operating aged care services for an extended period are likely to be significant and place great strain on the financial position of all providers. It might be said against us, Commissioners, that this is a judgment made with the benefit of hindsight. Of course it is, all judgments are. But none of these matters was unknown in February of this year. Many of them were documented in this Royal Commission's interim report provided to the Commonwealth last October. What use was made of that document in the COVID-19 planning, you may ask? There is still time for it to be put to good use. Turning, Commissioners, to maintaining quality of life. Just as important as preparing for and responding to outbreaks when they occur is maintaining the quality of life of those people living in residential aged care throughout the pandemic. All residents are legally entitled to quality care at all times. That doesn't change in an emergency. If anything, it becomes more important. Thankfully, many residents have to date not experienced an outbreak in their facility. They have, however, been subject to restrictions for most of this year, which go beyond those endured by the rest of us in the community. Many of these restrictions may unfortunately be necessary. We've seen the devastating consequences of COVID-19 outbreaks in residential aged care. However, it's important to acknowledge that for many, if not all residents, these restrictions have had and will continue to have serious consequences. As we heard this week, the impact of these restrictions has sometimes been tragic. As I noted earlier, Ms Mel Mitchell AM gave evidence this week about her experience. There have not been any cases of COVID-19 amongst staff or residents at her facility. However, it's been in lockdown since early February. Ms Mitchell said about the lockdown, and I quote, "From the time I wake up to the time I go to sleep, I'm sitting in my own room in my one chair, with her only view being that of a brick wall. She's seen her daughter twice during lockdown, once in a room with a glass partition, and more recently, for Ms Mitchell's birthday, through a window opened a crack to speak through." Commissioners, as you would have seen, Ms Mitchell is an active, self-described people person. She told you how the lockdown has meant she can no longer visit friends or receive the massages which make up part of her care plan. Ms Mitchell described the decline she's witnessed in residents living with dementia, who she believes do not understand why their families are no longer visiting them. She acknowledged the success of her facility in keeping the virus out, but she asks, at what cost? Commissioners, you have in previous hearings heard evidence about the important role played by those who are often called informal carers. These are often family members who supplement the care provided in residential aged care facilities. Their role is particularly critical in the many facilities with inadequate staffing levels, and they often play a critical role as the eyes and ears, monitoring the quality of care. A witness given the pseudonym UY described the impact that visitation restrictions had on her father, who died during the lockdown. UY was an informal carer for her father. Her father was non-verbal due to motor neurone disease, and he had dementia. An Italian man for whom family connection was everything. He relied on physical touch to communicate. Before lockdown, she visited almost every day to take him outside for the walks he loved, and she'd play games with him to keep his brain active. The restrictions imposed at his facility from the end of March allowed for window visits where family members had to wear masks, and eventually visits in a converted hairdressing salon where family would be separated by a glass partition. With the ability to hug and shake hands with his family taken away, UY's father would look very confused during their visits in the converted hair salon. She told you that she didn't want him living like that. UY petitioned to be able to take her father outside for socially distanced walks and was eventually granted permission to do this from mid-May. By this time, UY said she could see how much her father had deteriorated. On 6 June, UY's father went to sleep. He didn't wake up. He died 6 days later. UY told us she believed, and I quote, "Dad gave up wanting to live because his family support and connection was disconnected," end quote. UY has called for aged care facilities to allow key family members to continue to visit and care for their loved ones during the lockdown. She told us that an aged care facility will never replace the love and connection a family can give. Julie Kelly, a psychologist providing services in residential aged care facilities in Victoria, gave evidence that because of COVID-19, she's seen a large increase in depression, anxiety and confusion. She told you that suicide risk had increased. Ms Kelly explained that the significant changes to residents' day-to-day lives within a facility, as well as not being able to see family and friends, have caused a lot of anxiety. She said that loneliness has had a real impact on residents' mood and especially on depression. Ms. Kelly told you that for a lot of the residents, there's a real strong sense of hopelessness, of not knowing when this is going to end or being able to see any changes for them. Since COVID-19 cases first occurred in Australia early this year, visitation has been a contested issue. It was ultimately addressed through an industry visitation code, which was published on 11 May 2020. That code has been the subject of 3 reviews. It is not binding. We note that version 3 of the CDNA guidelines also notes the importance of visitors for the personal welfare and mental health of residents. Approved providers are understandably fearful of experiencing an outbreak of COVID-19. It's a natural reaction in these circumstances to take whatever action is available to limit the risk of such an outbreak. It was clear from the evidence that there are no easy answers to the questions of how to strike the right balance. Jonathan Anderson of Opal Aged Care described the overwhelming feedback from residents and their families to the effect that all they wanted was to keep their loved ones safe. But on the other hand, Dr. Stephen Judd reported that a Hammond Care survey of residents and families confirmed that most preferred to stay open to visitation, even if it presented a risk. It's not just the mental health of residents that is affected. As Ms. Angela Raguz from Hammond Care said, and I quote, "Underestimating the physical impact on people of not seeing people who they love, that's a mistake." She spoke of the need to balance and manage the risk. And Michael Lai from the Department of Health yesterday spoke of what he called the delicate balance that needs to be achieved and noted that he was not aware of any cases where visitation has resulted in a case of COVID-19 within a facility. You've heard evidence this week from providers about the measures they've implemented to strike the balance. Dr. Judd said that Hammond Care made the decision to continue allowing visitors into their facilities to see residents because we thought the pandemic was going to be a marathon, not a sprint, and that Hammond Care believed restricting visitation would have a very bad impact on its residents. We've heard evidence that Hammond Care set up a concierge service early on to coordinate and screen visitors. Other initiatives we heard about this week include walking programs and active and passive in-room exercise programs, connection coordinators or dedicated communication teams, and a training program for family members in infection control and PPE use. Clearly, such initiatives require resources and are dependent on adequate staffing. However, Ms. Butler of the ANMF and Ms. Smith of the United Workers Union both told you that the visitor code was developed without any consultation with the workforce and their representative organisations. They pointed to a lack of acknowledgement of the increased staffing numbers required to support the requirements in the code. Ms. Butler told you that as a result, the staff needs necessary to support the code's approach just come off the floor, increasing the workload and burden for the existing staff. Commissioners, the sector needs to appreciate the contribution that its workers and their representatives can make to work processes. You also heard evidence that with many residents missing out on regular visits, care workers feel a heavy burden to be their family and provide that care. It's axiomatic, Commissioners, that visits from family and friends are critical to the physical, mental and emotional health and wellbeing of people living in residential aged care. While technology is important and should be leveraged wherever possible, it cannot replace face-to-face contact. Does the existing code and other relevant guidance strike the right balance between safety, narrowly understood, and quality? To borrow the words of Professor Ibrahim, what else can be done to make the approach to visitation more humane? The position on visitation must be continually reviewed and revised and must be adapted to the particular circumstances of each facility. Innovative solutions must be celebrated and shared. Every effort should be made by providers and the department to encourage and facilitate safe visitation, even during periods of community transmission. We submit that a blanket ban on visitation is, however, unacceptable in all but extreme cases. Allied health. Commissioners, only a matter of weeks ago, you held a hearing which looked at mental and allied health in the context of aged care. You heard significant evidence about the important role these services play. You heard evidence from Mr. Rick Dawson and Ms. Julie Kelly, allied health professionals, about the negative impact on the health and wellbeing of COVID-19 restrictions on all residents in nursing homes, not just those managing a COVID-19 outbreak. Ms. Kelly is a psychologist delivering services into residential aged care facilities. Mr. Dawson is a gerontological physiotherapist. He's a director of the Australian Physiotherapy Association. Each of the witnesses spoke of the increasing levels of depression, anxiety, confusion, loneliness and suicide risk, and also reduced mobility and the long-term consequences of this. Mr. Dawson explained that reduced activity means older, frail people deteriorate very quickly. As you heard time and again during the Royal Commission, falls can be the beginning of decline and death for people in aged care. There's a real risk that reduced levels of physical and mental health will have long-term ramifications for residents. As Mr. Dawson said, once frail older people lose their mobility, may never return. Both Mr. Dawson and Ms. Kelly said restrictions have had an impact on their ability to provide services. While the visitation code and changes to the public health directives have provided more clarity, and despite allied health professionals being recognised as essential workers, we heard that some residential aged care residents have reduced access to allied health professionals at a time when there is an increased need. Ms. Kelly said that with the stage 4 restrictions, her business is considering the use of telehealth and only providing services on site to those who are clinically high risk. Mr. Dawson said that while the visitation code had helped, there are still a number of residents who are not getting the access at the moment because of the perceived risk of infection. In addition, physiotherapists are often only paid by providers through their aged care funding instrument funding to provide a limited range of pain relief services and not the mobility work that is urgently needed, as you'll recall from the Allied Health hearing. We submit the Australian Government should consider immediate action on this front. We've seen the government respond quickly to establish MBS items to increase mental health services for those living in the community. It should urgently take similar messages to support allied and mental health professionals to provide services to people in aged care during the pandemic to prevent deterioration in physical and mental health. Telehealth should also be included in options for service provision. Any barriers, be they real or perceived, to allied health professionals being able to enter residential aged care facilities should be removed. Conclusion, into an uncertain future. Commissioners, there have been 220 deaths of residents in residential aged care due to COVID-19. This represents 70% of all the country's COVID-19 deaths. On this measure, we're one of the worst performing countries in the world. Our elderly citizens and their families deserve better. We don't go so far as Professor Ibrahim and conclude that hundreds of residents will die prematurely because people have failed to act. The evidence before you does not enable that causal link to be made. But we do submit that it's open to you to conclude that the sector has been hindered in its response by a lack of coordinated planning by all levels of government. We also submit that it's open to conclude, based on the evidence of Professor McLaws and Professor Murphy, that masks should have been made compulsory earlier in aged care homes in Victoria, and that this may have reduced the spread of the virus and saved lives as a result. Commissioners, there is reason to think that in the crucial months between the Newmarch House outbreak in April and mid-June, a degree of self-congratulation and even hubris was displayed by the Commonwealth Government. Perhaps they were reflecting the general mood in the country, that we were through it. It seemed that Australia may have weathered the COVID-19 storm in a way that avoided the large-scale deaths seen in other countries. As late as 9 July 2020, the Aged Care Minister wrote to aged care providers telling them that they had, quote, responded incredibly well to the unprecedented challenges of COVID-19, close quote. Although the Minister did urge continued vigilance in the letter, and he warned that the battle was not yet over, there's no real sense of urgency in reading the letter. There was no suggestion, for example, that providers should consider asking their employees to wear masks. Finally, Commissioners, you'll recall that Professor Murphy was yesterday keen to compare Australia's performance with that of New Zealand. As you may be aware, New Zealand has very recently experienced a handful of COVID-19 cases after being virus-free for over 100 days. New Zealand immediately moved to level 4 alert, locking down its nursing homes and barring all family visits. Simon Wallace, New Zealand's Aged Care Association Chief Executive, has been quoted in the media as saying, and I quote, "We've seen what's happened in Melbourne, where aged care has been affected. More than 100 rest homes in Melbourne have had COVID-19 outbreaks, and they didn't move quickly enough. We can't afford to take any risks at all," he said. Perhaps, Commissioners, that's the ultimate lesson. When it comes to the health and safety of the residents in our nursing homes, we can't afford to take any risks at all. If the Commissioners.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Rosen, for your submissions. In a moment, we'll have a short adjournment before we start a separate hearing on a different topic occurring on the same day, but in fact a separate matter. But we wanted to thank you, Mr. Rosen, and those who have been assisting you in the preparation of the hearing and of the submissions that you've made to us today. We need also to thank the very many whose submissions to us since we called for submissions have helped inform the work that we've seen over the last few days, leading ultimately to the submissions, well, leading at the moment to the submissions that you have made to us. And we will thank in anticipation those who will make submissions pursuant to the order that we make today for the receipt of submissions. This has been an especially challenging hearing for all of us, and for that reason we do need to express our thanks to a large group of people right across the country who have enabled the hearing to take place at all and to have taken place with very few hitches. There are a number of technical people, some of whom I can see physically, one or two who Commissioner Briggs may be able to see at the moment, but many of whom are simply not visible to anybody, but without whose work the hearing could not have taken place. And we do want to thank all of you for that hard work behind the scenes, being, as I am able to see, constantly alert, making sure that things are being monitored, looked after. It is a matter of great thanks to you that it has gone as smoothly as it has. Not only have we had to work under these great difficulties, some of which have been created by the restrictions imposed as governments deal with the virus, but we've also had to work in the context of trying to gain an understanding of the impact of the virus on the aged care sector whilst it is still playing out and developing around us. That has been very difficult indeed, and in part reflected by the submissions that you've made, Mr. Rosen, that indicate that there is a lot of thought still to be done. Plainly, we're not in a position to make recommendations, but you've made a number of very many helpful suggestions, Mr. Rosen, in your submissions, and we've heard of a number of very helpful suggestions in the course of the hearing by people who have had direct experience and a great deal of personal expertise. We can only urge government to listen to that carefully. Such matters as you raised today, Mr. Rosen, such as a dedicated aged care specific national coordinating body to advise government, such things as additional staff so as to enable greater visitation in aged care homes so that the informal care that is missing can take place. These are all practical things that should perhaps not wait. As we've often heard, the virus doesn't wait, and nor should the measures that need to be implemented to deal with the virus wait either. However, thank you for those submissions, Mr. Rosen. I understand you wanted to say something before we formally adjourn.
I do. Thank you very much, Commissioner Begoni. I'd also like to endorse your thanks to the staff that have supported the running of the hearing this week, which, as you have observed, has taken place in particularly difficult circumstances. I'd like to mention by name Ms. Armandson, Ms. Hagger and their team, who have done a remarkable job supporting the work of the council assisting team. And I echo the observations you've made about the remarkable technical team that we have supporting the work and enabling it to proceed in, as can be seen on the screen, somewhat unusual circumstances. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll now formally conclude this hearing, but resume another hearing at 3:10. Thank you. Formally adjourned, please.
The Royal Commission is adjourned until 3:10 p.m. Royal Commission is now in session.
Yes, Mr. Knowles.
Thank you. Commissioners, I appear with Mr. Paul Bolster. I wish to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we and Commissioner Pagoni meet, the Gadigal people of the Aurora Nation, and for where Commissioner Briggs is, the Ngunnawal people, as well as the traditional custodians of the lands from which our witnesses appear today and tomorrow, and to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. At this hearing, Commissioners, you will hear evidence about accommodation as the setting in which aged care services are received. Although aged care services are received in people's homes and other community settings, as well as in residential aged care facilities, people often think of residential aged care when they think about aged care. By dollars spent, subsidised residential aged care is the Australian government's largest targeted strategy to support older people. However, while most money is spent on residential aged care, the majority of people stay at home for their whole lives. Around 1 million people receive aged care services in their homes or in other community settings, but only roughly 200,000 receive those services in a residential aged care facility. What accommodation is best for a particular person will depend on individual circumstances, including the person's likely needs in future. Accommodation should nonetheless promote ongoing engagement with services and community. It should also be adaptable to potential consequences of ageing, such as reduced mobility. So far as possible, accommodation should enable people to maintain autonomy and agency over their lives as they grow older. That should be so whether a person owns or rents a house, lives in social or affordable housing, or lives in residential aged care. If a person receives aged care services, whether in residential aged care or in private or public or community housing, the physical environment can and should promote the quality and safety of those aged care services. Commissioners, the Royal Commission's terms of reference authorise you to inquire into matters relating to accommodation. Paragraph C refers to, and I quote, the future challenges and opportunities for delivering accessible, affordable and high quality aged care services in Australia, including in the context of changing demographics and preferences, in particular people's desire to remain living at home as they age. That paragraph clearly contemplates consideration of the availability and design of accommodation other than residential aged care that is suitable for ageing in place and receiving aged care services. Paragraph B of the terms of reference refers to, quote, how best to deliver aged care services to people with disabilities residing in aged care facilities and the increasing number of Australians living with dementia. Building design principles, whether for residential aged care or other accommodation settings, and whether for people with disabilities or living with dementia or for older people more generally, affect the way in which aged care services are delivered. Lastly, paragraph F refers to, and I quote, how best to deliver aged care services in a sustainable way, including through innovative models of care, increased use of technology and investment in the aged care workforce and capital infrastructure. Council assisting and staff of the Royal Commission have prepared a series of 7 draft propositions for consideration at this hearing. These draft propositions are directed to possible ways in which the accommodation needs of older people, particularly those receiving aged care services, might best be met. The draft propositions relate to, first, coordinated government planning for suitable accommodation for Australia's ageing population. Secondly, incentives to increase the supply of private rental accommodation that is best suited for older people to age in place and receive aged care services. Thirdly, increased funding for social and affordable housing that is best suited for older people to age in place and receive those aged care services. Fourthly, development and implementation of national aged care design principles and guidelines for, among other things, accessible and dementia-friendly design. Fifthly, expansion of capital grants programs for construction projects for residential aged care facilities that meet those aforementioned national aged care design principles and guidelines. And sixthly, promotion of accessible, dementia-friendly small homes models of residential aged care. And lastly, changes to the National Construction Code or other regulatory frameworks to require accessible and dementia-friendly design in new or substantially refurbished residential aged care buildings. The draft propositions are chiefly concerned with improving access to suitable accommodation for ageing in place and receiving aged care services, whether that accommodation is owner-occupied, privately rented, social and affordable housing, or residential aged care. In this context, ageing in place is used to mean growing older in accommodation of one's own choosing. Greater access to accommodation that improves quality of life and maintains social connectedness is also vital. Tomorrow, Commissioners, 9 witnesses across 3 panels will give evidence. They will be asked to consider, among other things, the draft propositions relevant to their respective areas of expertise and experience. Today, after this hearing, 2 direct experience witnesses will give evidence from the United Kingdom about their experiences of co-housing in London. All witnesses will give evidence by video link. It is otherwise anticipated that at the conclusion of this hearing, we will request that you, Commissioners, make a direction for post-hearing submissions. There are 3 broad topics under consideration at this hearing. Tomorrow, each panel of witnesses will focus mostly on one of those topics. The topics are, first, the development of and timely movement into accommodation suitable for ageing in place and receiving aged care services. Secondly, better supply of social and affordable housing suitable for ageing in place and receiving those aged care services. And lastly, changes to physical design of future residential aged care buildings. Each of these topics is concerned, at least in part, with the suitability of accommodation for ageing in place. Accessible design is a matter that is integral to the suitability of accommodation for ageing in place. It ensures that accommodation remains suitable for people if, as they grow older, they have a new disability or experience age-related mobility problems. Housing should be designed to be readily adaptable over a lifetime. The Livable Housing Design Guidelines were first formulated in 2010 and continue to set standards for accessible and universal design in Australia. The guidelines have been developed by Livable Housing Australia, a partnership of community and consumer groups, government and industry. They do not have binding effect. Under the guidelines, though, there are 3 performance levels for accessible housing. Silver, which focuses on the key structural and spatial elements that are critical to ensure future flexibility and adaptability of the home. Gold, which provides for more generous dimensions for most of the core livable housing design elements and introduces additional elements in kitchens and bedrooms. And the highest level for accessible housing, Platinum, which provides for more generous dimensions again for most of the core livable housing design elements and introduces further additional elements for features such as living rooms and flooring. And it's the Platinum level which is described in the Livable Housing Design Guidelines as being better accommodated for ageing in place. It is not clear how widely the Livable Housing Design Guidelines have been adopted in residential aged care or in other accommodation settings for that matter. In 2010, the National Dialogue for Universal Housing Design, representing government, housing industry and community sectors, set an aspirational target for all new housing to meet at least the silver performance level by 2020. In 2015, the Australian Network for Universal Housing Design concluded that voluntary adoption of the Livable Housing Design Guidelines had failed and estimated that by 2020, less than 5% of new housing would meet or exceed the silver performance level. Mandatory building standards are set out in the National Construction Code. The Australian Building Codes Board is the standards writing body responsible for the development of the code. The Australian Buildings Codes Board is presently looking at including general accessibility standards for new housing in the code. It's considered various options based on performance levels in the Livable Housing Design Guidelines. In July this year, the Australian Building Codes Board published a consultation regulatory impact statement. That document was prepared for the Australian Building Codes Board by the Centre for International Economics. The Centre for International Economics undertook a cost-benefit analysis and reached the preliminary conclusion that, based on the preliminary evidence gathered for the consultation regulatory impact statement, the costs associated with including an accessible housing standard in the National Construction Code are estimated to outweigh the benefits under the central estimates for all of the options tested. Consideration of this proposed change to the code continues. We intend to ask witnesses tomorrow about what accessibility standards might be needed for various accommodation settings and how and when compliance with such standards should be encouraged or even required. Among other things, we proposed in the 5th draft proposition that national aged care design principles and guidelines should be formulated for dementia-friendly and accessible design of small home models for new residential aged care buildings. I now turn to the first issue under consideration at this hearing. That is, how can the availability of suitable accommodation options for older people be improved? That question begs other questions. For instance, is a national strategy for housing for ageing needed? Such an intergovernmental strategy is the subject of the first draft proposition. And what ends would such a strategy achieve? Do existing mechanisms such as the National Housing and Homelessness Agreement already achieve those ends? The majority of older people in Australia wish to remain at home as they aged. In 2014, around 73% of people over 65 years old lived in their own home, with another 7% renting their homes privately. But projections published in 2009 by the Australian Housing Urban Research Institute, or AHURI, show increasing housing insecurity. Among other things, AHURI predicts that in future, fewer older people will be homeowners and more of them will be renters. According to that AHURI modelling, by 2031, over 200,000 older Australians will be living in private rental housing and in need of assistance with one or more activities of daily living. There will likely be a need for some of those homes to be modified. However, private renters on low incomes have been found to be less able to obtain modifications to enable them to age in place. Tomorrow, some witnesses will be asked how best to increase the supply of private rental housing that allows for ageing in place. One option is government funding of an occupancy payment to supplement rent paid by older tenants in residents that meet accessibility standards. That option is at the core of the second draft proposition. For some people, the private rental market is beyond their means. They depend upon social and affordable housing, the supply of which has often not met demand. The Australian Housing Urban Research Institute has conducted surveys of social and affordable housing providers as well as residents. Those surveys show that there is a perception in both groups that there is a shortage of age-specific rental housing. The design of much existing social and affordable housing does not conform to contemporary accessibility standards like the Livable Housing Design Guidelines. A lack of accessible design affects tenants' ability to age in place and receive aged care services at home. Not only is there a well-documented general need for more social and affordable housing, there is also a specific need for more social and affordable housing that is suitable for older people to age in place. The third draft proposition is aimed at increasing funding to meet that need. The proposed means of achieving that aim is through the National Housing and Homelessness Agreement between the Commonwealth Government and the state and territory governments. Around 1.3 million people received aged care services last year. Only 242,000 of those people lived in residential aged care. Most people received aged care services in their homes. That's consistent with evidence and information before the Royal Commission that people generally prefer to remain living in their homes for as long as possible. That preference is expressly acknowledged in the Royal Commission's terms of reference as well. The reasons for that preference include maintaining independence, control and choice, and thereby enhancing quality of life, wanting to remain a part of intergenerational communities, emotional attachment to a place of residence with memories of family life, a sense of financial security, wealth and status from owning a house, feelings of safety and comfort from familiar surroundings, both in the home and in the surrounding local area, fear of institutional settings, particularly for certain groups, including those that have experienced trauma or discrimination, and lastly, cultural beliefs that caring for the elderly is the duty of the family. The suitability of a person's accommodation to the person's needs obviously changes over time. The physical design of a person's house bears on the safety of ageing in place and the person's ability to maintain the home. For instance, unsuitable housing might expose a person to a greater risk of falls, as well as injury, immobility, and the prospect of unanticipated entry into residential aged care. The size and location of a person's house can also affect the cost of delivery of aged care services. Commissioners, you've previously heard evidence that people should start thinking earlier about the ability of their homes to meet their future needs as they age. People should plan ahead. but that requires there to be available alternatives that might better meet their future needs. It also requires greater public awareness of those alternatives. If alternatives exist and there is awareness of their existence, older people might be encouraged to consider downsizing or right-sizing at an earlier point in time. Such downsizing has two important consequences. First, older people are able to move to accommodation more suitable for ageing in place and for receiving aged care services. Secondly, larger houses become available for younger people and their families. That might have broader intergenerational benefits. Dr. Brendan Radford, Policy and Advocacy Manager at National Seniors Australia, will give evidence tomorrow morning about the benefits of downsizing and what obstacles are faced by people wishing to do so and how those obstacles might be reduced or removed. You will also hear evidence tomorrow morning from Mr. Simon Shrapple, the Chief Executive Officer of Uniting Communities. He will tell you about the U-City development in central Adelaide. That mixed-use 20-storey development includes 6 stories of apartments specifically designed for retirement living and ageing in place. Access to services provided by Uniting Communities, including allied health and in-home support services, is also available to the occupants of those apartments. Mr. Shrapple is expected to give evidence about, among other things, what might be done to encourage development of more accommodation like U-City for older people. The final witness on the first panel tomorrow is Ms. Peter Harwood from Brisbane City Council. We intend to explore with her how urban planning can improve older people's connection to and place in community. We will ask her about what measures Brisbane City Council has put in place to encourage development of models of accommodation suitable for older people and how those measures might be adopted more widely across Australia. Later this afternoon, Commissioners, you will hear from Ms. Maria Brenton and Ms. Haydee Argent, who are members of Older Women's Co-Housing, or OUCH as it is otherwise referred to at times, about one particular innovative model of accommodation. They'll give evidence about the benefits and challenges of co-housing and how it has worked at Newground, a collaborative housing model in London, England. They'll reflect on the strong sense of community that exists at Newground for members of OUCH. Collaborative housing models such as co-housing can build stronger communities by supporting ways to share resources, pool skills, and promote social connection. While collaborative housing is not new, it still has little formal mainstream recognition in Australia. The evidence of Ms. Brenton and Ms. Argent presents a case for greater recognition. Indeed, in a recent report prepared for the Royal Commission by the National Ageing Research Institute, it was observed that, and I quote, co-housing involves residents in the design and management of their own communities. These models encourage social connectedness, reciprocal care, and active engagement in community life for the older people residing in them. We suggest there is scope for government to promote and support the development of these facilities through co-design with older people and consider how integrated person-centred care services could be co-located on site. Before leaving this first topic, it is important to stress that a considerable majority of older people do presently own their own homes. Moreover, around 65 to 70% of all home care recipients presently live in homes that they own or are purchasing. There is a need to encourage people to plan for their older age and to consider downsizing, right-sizing and relocating to types of accommodation that might suit their future needs better, whether that be in smaller homes or co-housing or collaborative housing or independent living units and other semi-supported accommodation. There should be incentives, or at least a reduction or removal of perceived disincentives for people to make those moves as they grow older. I've already referred to the second topic under consideration at this hearing, Commissioners, namely increased availability of social and affordable housing that is suitable for older people to age in place and receive aged care services. The terms of reference apply to all older people, whatever their financial circumstances. Insofar as they refer to people's preference to remain in their homes as they age, that preference should be a reality for all older people, whatever their means. However, there is evidence before you that that is not the case. At Adelaide Hearing 1, Ms. Clairwyn Little, National Director of Uniting Care Australia, said that a lack of secure, affordable housing was a problem faced by women accessing her organisation's services. In this context, she referred to a housing crisis and said that because access to home care packages depended on secure accommodation, that crisis had caused women to enter residential aged care prematurely. At Melbourne Hearing 2, Ms Fiona York, Chief Executive Officer of Housing for the Aged Action Group, gave evidence that when people talk about ageing in place, they wrongly assume that everyone owns their own home or has safe housing. She said that, and I quote, "It's very difficult to be able to provide home care in the home, whether it's Commonwealth Home Support or a home care package, if that housing is inappropriate, insecure, unaffordable." Ms York gave evidence that many of her organisation's clients on moving into secure accommodation showed a cessation in health decline and were less reliant on specialist healthcare services and aged care. Plainly, housing insecurity affects people's well-being. There is also evidence of a relationship between housing security and availability of home modifications to allow ageing in place. If ageing in place at home depends on such modifications, older people living in private rental accommodation and social and affordable housing should not have less access to them. However, the Chief Executive Officer of ECH Group, Dr. David Panter, stated at Adelaide Workshop 1 that, and I quote, "We are seeing more older people, particularly vulnerable older people, in rental accommodation. And we know from our experience there are huge challenges in getting landlords to agree to home adaptations, and all too often we are seeing older people at the annual turn of the lease being moved out of that rental property because the landlord will not pay to have handrails put in the bathroom." We will ask witnesses tomorrow what will increase the availability of secure, social and affordable housing that is suitable for older people, and in particular, what will drive funding for development of that housing. That topic was the subject of a very recent report prepared by Industry Super Australia for the New South Wales Community Housing Industry Council entitled "Fixing Affordable Housing in New South Wales and Beyond." Mr Michael Lynch, who is Executive Director of Impact Investing at Social Ventures Australia, will explain how social impact investment in social and affordable housing operates and how that kind of investment might be expanded in future to increase social and affordable housing in which older people can age in place and best receive aged care services. The remaining witnesses on the second panel tomorrow work for service providers for financially disadvantaged people. Dr. David Larmour is Acting Chief Operating Officer Community for the Bethany Group, a not-for-profit aged care and community housing provider in Western Australia. Ms Cathy Humphrey is Chief Executive Officer of Sacred Heart Mission, a not-for-profit service provider for people experiencing homelessness and financial disadvantage in Victoria. Each of them will share their knowledge of what accommodation problems are faced by people who access their organisation's aged care services. Bethany also provides residential aged care services to people who are experiencing financial disadvantage. We intend to ask Mr Larmour for his views on draft proposition 4, which is concerned with expanded eligibility for capital grants under the Aged Care Act 1997 and the Grant Principles 2014. It is proposed that eligibility for those grants should extend to construction of new and substantially refurbished residential aged care facilities that meet standards in the aforementioned National Aged Care Design Principles and Guidelines for Accessibility and Dementia-Friendly Design. Before I turn to the final topic, the subject of this hearing, I should mention the Australian Government's Assistance with Care and Housing sub-program, which is intended to assist people to remain living in the community as independently as possible for as long as possible. At Melbourne Hearing 2, Ms York said that hoarding and squalor are increasing for older people, but there are limited specialist services, training and resources for carers to support clients facing those difficulties. It is likely that programs such as the Assistance with Care and Housing sub-program will be even more necessary in future and may require expansion to meet demand. We anticipate that in the course of the giving of evidence by members of the second panel tomorrow, Ms Humphrey will tell you about the value of this Assistance with Care and Housing sub-program, which supports people who are experiencing homelessness to connect into specialist services and find appropriate accommodation. I now turn to the last of the three topics, the subject of this hearing, Commissioners, which is physical design of residential aged care buildings. With the three witnesses on the last panel tomorrow, we intend to test draft propositions relating to small home models of residential aged care. We will ask if principles of accessible and dementia-friendly design for residential aged care should be promoted as the expected norm, and if so, how this might best be done. These draft propositions and the evidence of the witnesses on the third panel will build on evidence already received by the Royal Commission at Sydney Hearing 1 and other hearings about small home models and accessible and dementia-friendly design in residential aged care. Witnesses at Sydney Hearing 1 gave evidence that a home-like environment with familiar furnishings together with smaller scale and lower density living arrangements is preferable for people living with dementia. It's hard to see how it would not be a better environment for everyone. The evidence of those witnesses emphasised that facilities with dementia-enabled design features promote better quality of life. On the other hand, sudden changes of physical environment, rigid routines, unfamiliar staffing and an institutional setting tend to contribute to poorer outcomes for people living with dementia, including causing distress, confusion and exit seeking. People living with dementia have been found to do better in a home-like environment. There is evidence that compared with traditional residential care, residents in a home-like environment experience lower admissions to hospital, and there are reduced numbers and prevalence of bedfast residents, catheter use, and pressure ulcers. People who do not have dementia can also benefit from a home-like environment incorporating dementia-friendly design principles. The sixth draft proposition is directed to moving residential aged care to an accessible, dementia-friendly small home model of accommodation and care. The last draft proposition concerns the incorporation of minimum design standards for, among other things, accessibility and dementia-friendly design in all new and substantially refurbished residential aged care buildings. We will ask witnesses in the third panel tomorrow about whether, and if so how, these proposed changes should occur. Mr. Robert Bahor, Director at Spowers Architects, has extensive experience in design of residential aged care facilities and other buildings for congregate living. He will give evidence about what constitutes best practice and how it can become more widespread. Adjunct Professor Stephen Cornelison, Group Chief Executive Officer of Mercy Health, and Mr. Frank Whites, Chief Executive Officer of ACH Group, run approved providers of residential aged care, as well as conducting businesses that deal with other care services. Each of them will give evidence about how, for their respective organisation, any transition away from institutional models of accommodation has been managed in practice and could best be managed in future. That third panel will conclude the evidence at this hearing. Now, Commissioners, I asked the operator to bring up the general tender bundle index at this juncture. Yes. And the first page of that index now appears on the screen, I believe. And I'd seek, as is customary, to tender the general tender bundle for the Sydney 3 hearing, Commissioners.
Yes, Exhibit 19-1.
Thank you, Commissioner Pagoni. The first witnesses will be Ms Maria Brenton and Ms Haydee Argent of Older Women's Co-housing. They're going to appear by video link from the United Kingdom, and we'd seek a short adjournment to set up that video link.
Yes, all right. Well, we'll momentarily step down. We'll resume as soon as we've made that link. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner.
The Royal temporarily adjourned. The Royal Commission is now in session.
Commissioners, I call Ms Brenton and Ms Argent.
Ms. Brenton, do you solemnly and sincerely declare and affirm that the evidence you shall give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Please say, I do.
I do.
Ms. Argent, do you solemnly and sincerely declare and affirm that the evidence you shall give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Please say, I do.
I do.
Good morning for you, Ms Argent and Ms Brenton. Ms Brenton, can I ask you at the outset to state your full name for the Royal Commission?
Maria Brenton.
Thank you. And Ms Argent, could you please state your full name for the Royal Commission?
Hedy Argent.
Thank you. And Ms Brenton, you prepared a statement, RCD.9999.0395.0001, and a copy of that statement will appear on the screen, the first page of it at least, in a moment. That's dated the 29th of July 2020. That's an 8-page statement signed by you. Have you had an opportunity to read your statement lately?
I have.
Yes. And are there any changes that you wish to make to your statement?
I suppose just to further emphasize that it's a positive living model, not a care model.
Yes, thank you, Ms Brenton. Save for that emphasis, are the contents of your statement true and correct to the best of your knowledge and belief?
Yes.
Thank you, Ms Brenton. I seek to tender the statement of Maria Brenton dated the 29th of July 2020.
Exhibit 19-2.
Thank you, Commissioner. Ms Brenton, you're currently the Senior Co-housing Ambassador of the UK Co-housing Trust, a charity you helped to establish.
Correct.
Can you briefly tell the Royal Commission a little bit about yourself, your background?
I'm a retired academic and I got into co-housing because I got interested in old age. And I focused on women particularly because they are the ones who are left mostly alone in old age on lower incomes than men. So I set out to do research on collaborative measures that they might be taking in different countries to address that issue. And I went to Holland, Denmark, the States, and Canada, looking at various models. And the one I found that was most amenable to translation to a UK context was the senior co-housing model, or what in Holland they call living groups.
Yes. Thank you, Ms Brenton. Ms Argent, can you please tell the Royal Commission a little bit about yourself and your background?
Right. I've always been interested in community and in community support. I've, in my work, as well as in my own personal life, I've sought to be a part of a community, a self-supporting community. And when I was left on my own, when my partner died 10 years ago, I looked around for a way to live that would fulfill that kind of desire. And it took me quite a long time. And I came across Ouch quite accidentally. A friend of mine saw a notice in the library and said to me, "Is this what you're looking for, this sort of thing?" And I said, yes. And I went along and I sort of, got stuck there immediately. And that was before we moved in, of course, yeah.
And when you mention Ouch, you're referring to older women's co-housing?
Older women's co-housing, yes, which we call Ouch.
And when did each of you become members?
Well, I became a member then, which is now 9 years ago. And that's it. And I was, became part of that community. And I mean, it's important to stress over and over again that we formed the community and then found a site and moved in. But it was the the social building of the community that was really very, very important at the beginning.
And I became,
Ms.
I was
Brenton, you were
given,
there right at the beginning.
well, yes, right back in 1998. But when the group moved in, they made me a lifetime member in recognition of the fact that of all the effort I'd put in, although I do not live there.
Yes. Can you say, Ms. Brenton, why older women's co-housing was formed? I mean, you've alluded to it earlier that housing and accommodation problems, so far as you are aware, are particularly pronounced for women who are older.
Yes, indeed. In our country, we are still labouring, as I fear Australia is, under a sort of care or welfare model in relation to older people, as if they are objects to be looked after and poor things. We are trying to help the British system change from that old poor law emphasis, which is so old-fashioned, it's unbelievable, and older people don't want it. Women themselves are 60% of those who live alone after the age of 75. And that goes up to a higher proportion to 70% in the 80s. So it is, as I said before, women who tend to live alone. And when their families leave the nest, then they're quite likely to get a bit lonely and isolated, particularly if they're in housing situations where they don't know their neighbours. We wanted to address that problem.
Yes.
To be somewhere where you knew all your neighbours.
And how many... Oh, sorry,
So,
Ms. Brenton.
That's
Do
fine.
continue. I don't mean to interrupt you.
No, that's all right.
No, I was just going to ask you, how many members does Ouch have, and what's the sort of range of women that are members of Ouch?
It has 26 resident members in 25 flats, all self-contained and purpose-built. There are a further something like 8 non-residential members who are potential members for the future and who interact with the community fairly frequently, so that they also become potential familiar neighbours.
What's the process for people to become a member of Ouch?
Well, I think Heidi's the best person to answer that.
Yes, you've gone through that process.
Yeah, okay, yes, and also, you know, the way we manage ourselves, we have several groups that managed at various aspects, and one of them is the membership group, which is one of the groups that I formed. The idea, the aim, no matter how it's done, is really that the new potential member must get to know every one of us, and that every one of us must get to know that potential member. So the process is designed to achieve that. And potential members are asked to come along to group meetings, task groups, management groups, practical groups like doing some gardening together or cleaning the common areas together or cooking, as well as the more sort of formal management groups. And it usually takes some months for them to become a non-resident member, because it takes quite a long time to get to know 26 other people.
Yes. What's the age range of the members of Ouch?
51 to 91.
And where are you on that, if you don't mind me asking, Ms. Argent?
I'm the one that's 91.
Right. Now, the numbers, you say there's 26 members. Was that a deliberately, 26 resident members, was that a deliberately chosen number? Yes. Why is that, Ms. Brenton? What was the rationale for 26 members, so?
I took the model from advice from the many groups that I visited in Holland, where they wanted to be large enough to have choice, so you didn't have to ask everybody to coffee. You can't invite 26 people to coffee, so it's quite a handy number. It's also large enough to, in our case, to afford the expense of having and maintaining a lift, which we need. but it's not so large that you can't make decisions together. And the group makes all its decisions as a group by consensus, which is quite a protracted process, but a very thorough one at times. Can be difficult even with 26 women, but you wouldn't want 56 women or 56 anybody. It's difficult the larger the group gets.
Yes. So I take you to say it's a balancing act, and that's where you've struck the balance.
Indeed.
Yes. Ms. Argent, you're a resident member of Ouch, so you have lived at Newground in Barnet, in London, the Ouch community there, since people first moved in 2016. Is that right?
That's right, yes. December the 1st, first of us moved in.
And Ouch has a website on which videos show the premises and the community. I don't propose to go to those now, but if I can just bring up, firstly, a couple of representations of the site. You'll see the first document is RCD.quadruple9.0449.0005, which is a plan, an architectural drawing, pardon me.
Right.
Do you both see that? So,
Yes.
Can you just describe, Ms. Argent, what the sort of buildings are that we see there that are in colour, distinct from the rest of the drawing?
Right, yes, I can. The pink houses, as you say, they're the different colour. They were built to be in keeping with the rest of the street, which is important for planning permission. As you can see, they're not unlike the other houses. But they are completely purpose-built with as much sort of green stuff in them as we could afford at the time and was possible at the time. There are, on the roof, we have electric panels, etc. You'll see that the green is a lawn, which is the central part of our garden, surrounded by very beautiful flower beds, which you can't see on this diagram. But that's kind of the community centre, as it were. It's where we meet people. You can't really go out into the garden very often without bumping into somebody and having a chat. It's the kind of nerve centre of Newground.
Can I take you to another document, which is .0004, which is the plan, the ground floor plan. Do you see that?
Yeah.
So there you in the middle, there is the green lawn that you have referred to. What's the space off to the left at the bottom left-hand corner of that drawing?
Yes, indeed. Well, that's what we call variously our orchard, although it isn't really an orchard, but it's a vegetable garden. We grow a lot of our own vegetables, including a vast crop of potatoes this year. And it's all surrounded by flowers. So the flowers intermingle with the vegetables, and there's a little pond for wildlife and a garden shed, which is more than a shed, it's sort of garden room where we can sit and have a cup of tea. And the square things are raised beds for people who can't bend down very easily, but want to do some gardening. So it's a very lively place, as well as the it's the work end of the garden where we do all the heavy work.
And Ms. Argent, at the top right-hand corner of the design there, you'll see a common house. The common house area in the diagram. Can you just describe what the common house, and it'll be enlarged in a moment, but what sort of purpose the common house serves?
Right. Okay. Well, yes, you can see it has two other rooms going off it. The first one is a very large commercial-sized kitchen, and the second one is an office. And the common house itself, the room, is where we have all our major meetings when we don't have coronavirus. At the moment, we can't meet there. We have our communal meals there. We have a communal meal once a week that we cook ourselves, of course. And any smaller meetings go on there. We have a film club. We have a sketch club. People have an exercise club. They do all sorts of exercises. It's a room that we can all use for communal purposes.
Yes. And in terms of the 25 apartments on the site, can you just explain what the respective ownership arrangements are for those apartments?
Maria, would you like to answer
Well,
Yes,
that?
perhaps I'll ask you, Ms. Brenton.
Okay. It's a mixed tenure development, which is not a very usual one in the UK. Of the 25 apartments, 17 are leaseholders apartments. So they're purchased on the open market by individuals and they're owned by them. And the other 8 are owned by a small housing association, which is the landlord for 8 women who are eligible for publicly subsidized rental units.
And what was the rationale behind that breakup of the apartments where you have 17 odd that are long-term lease or owned, and then the remainder being the subject of public housing arrangements?
The aim of the Ouch Group right from the very beginning was that it should be socially and economically inclusive of women who couldn't afford to buy their own homes. The vast majority of older people in Britain do own their own homes, but there is a minority who cannot. So the group has always felt that to be equitable and fair, they should hold out to include mixed tenure. The numbers 8 and 17 were the economics of it. Those 8 have to be subsidized in some way. And we actually had to find the money through in unusual means to build those 8 flats because government grants were not forthcoming.
Yes. What were those unusual means?
Well, there's a charitable trust called the Tudor Trust in London, which had brought me in several years before because they got interested in almshouses. And I said, oh, you don't want to look at anything so old-fashioned. Look at us. And they put money into our communication needs and our meeting expenses and that kind of thing. When it came to the point where it looked as if we could not deliver 8 flats because government grants had all been cut, they stepped in and offered a substantial capital grant in order to make the whole thing succeed. So they put in 1.1 million into the scheme, and the Small Housing Association was able to borrow against that to finance the 8 flats.
Yes. Now, can I bring up page 0002, the photograph taken from that central lawn area? That's a photograph there from the central lawn area looking back to the apartments, Ms. Argent?
Yeah.
Yes. And can you tell the Royal Commission why you decided to live at New Ground? I mean, you've already referred to some of the reasons when you first went along and met with people and responded to the ad. What are the range of reasons why you decided to live there?
Well, I was getting older. And I thought it was my responsibility to make plans for my old age rather than wait till I became decrepit and other people had to make arrangements for me. I never intended for other people to decide what I would do in my old age. And this is the way that we do it. I mean, we are all independent. We manage ourselves. Nobody tells us what we are not done unto. We do it ourselves, we manage ourselves, and we are becoming old and staying independent. I think we're staying healthier than we would normally stay. And I think it's worth mentioning under COVID pandemic at the moment, there are 26 of us. We make our own guidelines about how to behave, and not one of us has got sick. So that in a way we stay independent in all sorts of ways. I think we make less claims on health services than we would if we were living alone. We make less claims on all kinds of social services than we would if we were living alone, because we are interdependent and mutually supportive.
Can I just ask you about that, Ms. Argent? You've referred to the approach taken in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Can you go into a little detail about what the members of Ouch did and how they responded to it for their own part and their community, and how they've continued to respond?
Okay, yeah. We decided right at the beginning that we were not one household, we were separate households, and that therefore we were not able to go in and out of each other's homes. If we met in the garden, and we kept our social distance. Those of us who were older, those of us, I suppose, well over 80, did not go out. Other people did our shopping for us. When people went out, they strictly wore masks and gloves, and they sanitized as soon as they came back in. We twice a day, we have a rota, we sanitize the whole building, all the doorknobs, light switches, everything that anybody touches gets sanitized twice a day, and still do in the morning and in the evening. And we have hand washing masks and gloves available for us all.
Yes. How was it agreed on all of these processes that you've described? What was the process for actually agreeing it? Was it a meeting of all of the members at some point?
We have an elected
Zoom or something like that?
Yeah. We have an elected management committee. Yes. And we kind of delegated to them to make the guidelines, because it had to be done quickly, and we couldn't get together. We got together on Zoom, and we then agreed what the management committee suggested.
Yes. So what you're saying is that ultimately, though, there's a need for the community members to sign off on those guidelines proposed by the management committee.
Oh, indeed. Yes, we sign off on everything. Anything that is decided has to be signed off by the whole community, by consensus.
And how does that work? Are there regular meetings, Ms. Argent, at which things are decided in that way?
Yeah, in normal times, whatever they are, in normal times, we meet once a month, all of us together in the common room, for a whole morning, and that's followed by a potluck lunch that we share. And that's where all decisions are made. Every single thing that has to be decided is decided there. Now, the proposals are made by various members or by various groups or by the management committee, and those proposals are discussed and agreed, and they're not passed as an agreement until everybody is on board. If somebody blocks it, if somebody doesn't want to go along with it and wants to block it, they have to go away and form their own group to come back with a different proposal. And this can go on for some time, but nothing is decided until everybody is on board.
Thank you. Ms. Brenton, can I take you to a passage in your statement, which appears at the top of page 5 in paragraph 16, and that should appear shortly on the screen.
It's okay, I've got it in front of me.
There we go. So you'll see there a paragraph relating to design of new ground. And you've said there that Ouch members chose both the site and the architects. They worked with the latter to design the building, which has won 8 architectural awards as an entirely age-friendly and accessible, and therefore a last home, if so desired. What particular design features of new ground are age-friendly and accessible? I mean, you've mentioned a lift earlier. What other features of the apartments, the common areas and the grounds are age-friendly and accessible?
All the doorways and passages are extra wide, so that actually every flat in the development would give access to a wheelchair user. All the bathrooms are particularly large and generous with lots of turning space. The accessibility and age-proofness of the building is probably at its maximum. In terms of co-housing, one of the features that we spent some time on was getting a light and airy building, lots of light, lots of big windows, and also circulation spaces where the members of the group would meet spontaneously rather than by arrangement. So there's a lot of casual meeting up on the site. It just happens, and that increases the social cohesion of the group, as in fact did the participation of the group with the architects in the design. And far more important than the actual design, lovely as it is, was the boost it gave to the solidarity of the group and its belief that what it had worked for so long was going to happen.
Yes. Can I ask this question? Arguably somewhat sensitive question, but do any, you've said that the design in some ways seeks to cater for people who might begin to experience effects of dementia. Can you describe how that is so?
I don't think we set out to, but that happened. And I mean, looking back in retrospect, I'm very glad it did. Because I mean, I have seen in one of my careers quite a number of dementia hospitals, and it's giving people wandering space where they are safe and secure is paramount importance. And actually, we achieved that without even thinking about it, probably due to the design of that site, as you just put it up on the screen. There is one point of access. So people come in and out of the one front door. And if there is a degree of confusion and people start to wander, as can happen, it hasn't happened, but it can, then all you would need to do is put a keypad on that front door and somebody would be safe, would be contained.
What other principles influenced the design of the new ground building, Ms. Brenton?
Well, we got it as green as we could, but that was a question of affordability. So we had a trade-off, really. We would have liked to go for a passive house design, where, I mean, we were constantly promised, actually, that the heating bills would be very low because of the high standards of insulation in the building. I'm not sure that promise has been delivered on, but that's what we wanted. We've also got quite a lot of downpipes to water butts. We would have liked some way of recycling grey water, but that didn't appear to be within the capabilities of the construction people.
Yes. Can I ask you this, Ms. Argent? What are the arrangements in place for upkeep and maintenance of common areas? You've already referred to the fact that there's a rota for cleaning and disinfecting during COVID times. What are the general arrangements that are in place otherwise? How are they agreed and worked out?
We have a cleaning firm come in twice a year to do a deep clean. Apart from that, we keep it clean ourselves. Again, we have it's a rota that various people are responsible for various bits of the building. I mean, for instance, you know, I do the ovens, the hobs, and the fridges. Everybody is responsible for something, and we keep the place clean ourselves.
Yes. And in terms of the maintenance that's done by external providers, and you just referred to a deep clean undertaken by external providers, how's payment arranged for those sorts of services amongst the group?
Right. Well, one of our policies, the procurement policy, is that we have to get 3 estimates for anything that is going to be done outside that is more than £50. And so that's what we have to do. And there is a household group, for instance, and the household group would be responsible for getting those 3 estimates, forwarding it to the finance group, getting it approved by the community as well, that this should be done, and then go ahead and do it.
Yes.
It's a, it can be quite a process, but it works.
Yes.
And we
Yes.
do it. Nobody does it to us.
And we set our own service charges. I mean, when we
That's
set
where-
up, that's what I think
Yes,
you
I
were
was going
getting.
to
How
ask
do you
that as
pay
well,
for it?
Ms. Brenton. How are the relevant expenses shared amongst the community?
The first thing we did was set up a procurement committee to set the policies for the finances of the group right at the beginning. And part of that was agreeing the service charges, which we have charged each flat by room space. So the larger flats pay more than the smaller flats.
Yes.
Those service charges go towards everyday maintenance and long-term maintenance. And there is a buildings subcommittee which has in fact engaged a surveyor recently to do a long-term plan for the maintenance of the building. And that small committee keeps an eye on all the maintenance issues that come up. And they are funded directly from the service charges, which have not so far, Heidi, had to be raised in 3-4 years, have they?
No. Again, there is another group that looks after the service charges. And so far, it's remained the same. We think we may have to raise the charges in the next 21-22.
Yes.
We also hire a management company, Richard. A management company is hired by the group to do routine health and safety things like electric checks and that sort of thing on a regular basis, and the servicing of the communal area boilers and those sorts of things.
Yes. And in terms of, you mentioned that those sort of expenses are allocated, or the payment for them is allocated depending on the size of people's residences. How does it work for people who are in the public or social housing residences? What contribution do they make a different contribution to that particular set of expenses than people who own their own or long-term lease their own apartment?
It's according to the size of the flat.
Yes. Okay.
They tend to be all one-bedroom flats. So
Yes.
theirs will be a standard amount.
Yes.
And some of it will be payable from public funds.
Yes. Can I ask you this? You said earlier that not only did the group have involvement in the design of the premises, but also the location. How did you choose the particular location of the site at Barnet?
We, when I finally found a housing association that would employ a site finder for us, we set out a set of criteria against which a judgment could be made. So we wanted a site that was minutes from shops, banks, post offices, transport routes, and that kind of thing. We were actually presented with, I think, a choice of 12 sites in London, which I and somebody else in the group plodded around and looked at all the way through different parts of London. And this was the one that met our criteria most nearly. It is 2 minutes from a busy high street, although you wouldn't know it. And it's on good transport routes.
Yes. In terms of the community at Newground, there are a range of policies that are on the website, and one of them is the policy of mutual support, which I think reflects what you've said in your statement of paragraph 23, Ms. Brenton, that each of the people in the community doesn't look after the other, but looks out for them. Now,
that's Heidi's phrase.
Well, the policy from the website states that there is a group commitment to mutual support, and that means that members undertake to offer reciprocal services and receive benefits in a spirit of neighbourliness. This is understood to mean one-off or short-term assistance for a range of minor contingencies, but not long-term and regular personal care that more properly should be provided by professional or welfare services. Ms. Argent, can you describe what are some of those one-off short-term assistance examples for a range of minor contingencies that are referred to?
Yeah. And actually, minor contingencies in that sense includes one woman who had a very serious operation at the beginning of last year. And we also maintained her, or she maintained herself with our help at home after the operation. So what would happen is we would have a rota of meals. We would cook for that person who needed help. And we would take it in turns. We would probably actually put up a rota on the notice board so that people could put their names down on it. It's voluntary, of course. And we would make sure that that person who was in some sort of need had food, had a meal once a day, and had enough food to have breakfast, make drinks, etc. We would be responsible, take responsibility for going in to see her to make sure several times a day that she was okay. Now, if she also needed, which for instance this woman did who'd had a serious operation, nursing care of some kind, we would not undertake that. And a nurse did come in twice a day to do things. And we would not expect to do any kind of nursing care for each other. But that doesn't mean to say that if somebody hurt themselves, one of us who is a nurse wouldn't come and do something.
Yes.
It's all kind of, it's like living in a very small village where you know everybody and you know everybody's needs, and you automatically see to them.
Yes. How is Newground designed in such a way as to allow for those external services, care services, to be accessed by people who live there? Is there anything
we
that
have
is done to allow for that?
Like everyone in the country, we have a right to access the health service. We have like you have, I think, a very reasonable health service when the government allows it. And we have the same access as anybody else. We are all registered with the GP. There are two very local general practitioners with their own surgeries very near us. In fact, one is just opposite and one is at the back of the building. We're all registered there. Our local hospital is really walking distance. It's half a mile away. It has an emergency room, an A&E service, and we use the health service as everyone else would, except, as I said earlier, I think we use it a lot less than we would if we were not living in this community.
Yes. Now, can I ask you, Ms. Brenton, you've said in your statement at paragraph 12 that there are no other senior co-housing communities in the United Kingdom. Why do you say that's the case? What's the reason in your mind that you're the one and only in that regard?
In a word, ageism.
Right. Can you elaborate on that?
I think I've already pointed out that we, I think, a bit like Australia, are kind of stuck in the 19th century in terms of seeing older people as objects of care. It's very difficult to get the relevant actors in the housing sector to address this different model of older people's independent living. There is a very strong streak of paternalism in our culture, where older people are seen to need things done to them rather than being able to do things for themselves. Mm-hmm. We have, the reason why it took us so long was because we needed the cooperation and the support of local authorities, the planning authorities in different parts of London where we were looking for sites. And that was not forthcoming, and it was a big struggle. Around the country, it's compounded, that sort of paternalism and attitude is compounded by the difficulties, which I think are shared in Australia, of getting land. the I mean, the sitting by sitting on land holdings by the big volume developers is nothing short of a scandal. There are thousands and thousands of planning permissions that have not been enacted because they're waiting, they're just trying to keep their values up, their prices. So it's very, very difficult from one end of the land to the other to get a site. And it's very difficult to also overcome the natural, understandable preference of local authorities to support family housing rather than older people's. They'd rather older people's housing was somebody else's responsibility.
What measures or incentives would you say each of you would make co-housing options easier to pursue from your experience? Can I start with you, Ms. Brenton? Well,
we had a brave stab at this just lately. The co-housing movement, community-led housing movement, got the government to put big funds, 163 million, behind community-led housing initiatives, which included co-housing. So up until March this year, a program that only started in 2019 ended for getting this 163 million dispersed around the country to help groups find themselves architects and developers and whatnot. That has not been sustained. We've had 10 housing ministers in the last 10 years. So there has been nothing in the way of continuous housing policy in Britain that could stand up and say it was respectable, really. So if our fight to get this community-led housing fund is sustained, it had already spawned what I found in Holland 20 years ago, the beginnings of an infrastructure of support and guidance to groups like ours, so that you can call on an advisor, and I'm one, you could call on an advisor to help you through what is rather a difficult process of getting planning and all that kind of stuff, which most people are not very familiar with. But the funds have now been withdrawn, and we're campaigning to get them reinstated.
Ms. Argent, is there anything you wish to add in terms of what might make co-housing options easier to pursue?
Well, I think it's very much what Maria said. It's really, it needs to have a complete change of attitude towards aging and old people. Ageism is the thing that that really stops the development of seeing what is it old people actually want, and what makes an old person an old person. You know, the whole thing is it's like it's easier and safer to put us away really somewhere, tuck us away somewhere, and manage us and do it all for us. It's easier in a way to get rid of it. They make us a problem rather than quite a vibrant kind of part of our community here. We have to stop making old people a problem.
Thank you, Ms. Argent. Is there anything else that either of you wish to tell the commissioners about best accommodation models for people as they get older?
That they should be in charge of them. Older people should be in charge of their own environments.
Ms. Argent?
Yeah, I'd like to give you the example of one of the women who lives here, who is one of the tenants in the flat, a one-bedroom flat, who'd lived all her life in a council house, in a big council development. And as she grew older, and the friends she'd had when she was young moved away, and a lot of people died, and she was left completely isolated. She didn't really know anybody anymore, and she was totally miserable and depressed. And she heard about Ouch, and she joined us, and she became a member, and she's moved in here. And she says that she feels like somebody reborn. She feels like somebody who's been given another life that she didn't even know existed.
Thank you, Ms Argent. I have no further questions for Ms Argent or Ms Brenton, Commissioners.
Thank you, Mr Knowles. Commissioner Briggs, do you have some questions that you'd like to ask?
I have a very simple question. For those people who are renting their houses or their flats, are those rents at the same level as they would otherwise pay for housing paid for by the government?
Yes.
Or do you have a particular rate?
The housing association landlord had the option to retain the original, what we call social rents, rather than move to the government's new rents, which are 80% of the market, which are for very many people unaffordable. So they are at the lowest possible rents, and they are assured rents, and they have assured tenancy. So they're very secure.
Thank you. That's why I asked the question, to see how secure the arrangement was. Thank you both for your evidence. It's been terrific. That's it from me, Commissioner.
Thank you. Yes, thank you both very much for getting up what for us sounds an early time and giving this evidence. It's very helpful to hear of your experience in the UK. We are learning as much as we can about the best arrangements for people who are ageing, and we're delighted that you've been able to assist us by giving us your time, your experience, which I know is not just the half hour or so that you've been with us on air, but a lot of preparation time before then. And so thank you both very much. I think it may sound odd to you now, but I must, as a matter of form, excuse you from further attendance. Otherwise, you might be picked up somewhere and dragged off to prison. So I formally excuse you from further attendance. And thank you again for participating today.
Bye-bye.
Mr Knowles?
Yes, thank you, Commissioner. That concludes the evidence for today. I understand that the intention is that the hearing will resume tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock.
Yes, we'll adjourn now until 9 o'clock tomorrow morning.
Thank you, Commissioners.
The Royal Commission is now adjourned until 9 a.m. on Friday, 14 August.